The road stretched out in front of him, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the inky blackness. Mark had been driving for hours, the hum of the engine the only sound in the still night. The dashboard clock glowed a faint green, its numbers ticking forward in relentless monotony. Midnight had come and gone, leaving the world in a cocoon of silence and shadows. Mark's eyes felt heavy, the fatigue of a long day creeping up on him. He rolled down the window, hoping the cool night air would keep him awake. The wind whipped into the car, bringing with it the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a lonely stretch of road, rarely travelled at this hour. He hadn't seen another car for miles. The trees on either side loomed tall and dark, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As he rounded a bend in the road, something caught his eye. A figure stood by the roadside, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights. Mark's heart skipped a beat, the sudden appearance startling him. He slowed the car, peering through the windshield to get a better look. The figure was draped in a long coat, its collar turned up against the chill. They stood still, almost unnaturally so, as if they had been waiting. Mark hesitated, his mind racing. What were they doing out here at this hour? He pulled the car to a stop a few feet away, the engine idling softly. The figure moved, stepping into the light. It was a man, his face shadowed by the brim of a hat. He raised a hand in a gesture that was both a greeting and a plea. Mark's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, uncertainty gnawing at him. "Need a ride?" Mark called out, his voice sounding overly loud in the quiet of the night. The man nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He climbed into the car, settling into the passenger seat with an air of calm that did little to ease Mark's nerves. Mark glanced at the man, trying to get a better look at his face. It was pale, almost ghostly, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "Where are you headed?" Mark asked, his voice strained. The man turned slowly, his gaze meeting Mark's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "Just drive," the man said, his voice low and smooth. There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a quiet authority that made Mark hesitate. He nodded, swallowing hard, and put the car back in gear. The engine growled as they resumed their journey, the road stretching out ahead like a dark ribbon. The silence in the car was heavy, almost oppressive. Mark's mind raced with questions, but he didn't dare ask. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless path through the inky blackness. Mark could feel the tension building, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. He turned the radio back on, hoping to drown out the silence. Static crackled through the speakers, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The man beside him was too still, too quiet. He needed to break the silence. "So, where were you headed?" "Do you travel this road often?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's gaze was unyielding, as if he could see right through him. "Sometimes," he replied, his tone cryptic. It wasn't much of an answer, but Mark didn't press further. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about this stranger. Mark tried to keep his eyes on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the passenger. There was a coldness about him, an air of detachment that was unsettling. He glanced over, only to find the man staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. It was as if he was lost in his own world, disconnected from the reality around him. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive. Mark's thoughts began to wander, conjuring up scenarios that only added to his unease. The man shifted in his seat, breaking the silence. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. The man's words echoed in his mind, adding a layer of dread to the already tense atmosphere. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just a trick of the imagination. But the man's presence was too real, too unsettling to ignore. As they drove on, the air inside the car seemed to grow colder. Mark glanced at the temperature gauge, but it read normal. A quick look at the man beside him showed no reaction to the chill. It was as if he didn't feel it, or perhaps he welcomed it. Mark couldn't tell, and that made it all the more unnerving. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of the forest that bordered the road. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The words sent a chill through Mark, the man's tone making it clear he wasn't talking about ordinary disappearances. The road seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Mark's heartbeat quickened, a sense of impending doom settling over him. He glanced at the man, but his expression remained unreadable, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Out of nowhere, the car's headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the trees. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "What's happening?" he muttered, more to himself than to the man beside him. The man remained silent, his calm demeanor only adding to Mark's growing terror. Suddenly, the headlights went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. Mark slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. He fumbled for the switch, trying to turn the lights back on, but they remained stubbornly off. Panic set in, his mind racing with thoughts of what might be lurking in the shadows. Mark's scream seemed to hang in the air, the darkness swallowing the sound. He tried to move, to break free from the man's grip, but his body refused to obey. The man's eyes bored into him, a cold, relentless gaze that seemed to pierce his very soul. "You shouldn't have stopped," the man said, his voice a haunting echo. "Now there's no turning back." Mark's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The man's face, once shadowed and indistinct, now seemed to shift and change, as if it were made of mist. His eyes glowed with an eerie light, casting an otherworldly pallor over his features. Mark felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, his pulse pounding in his ears. The car seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick and heavy. Mark struggled to breathe, his chest tightening with fear. The man's grip tightened, his fingers like ice against Mark's shoulder. When Mark awoke, he was alone in the car. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the landscape. He blinked, trying to clear his head, but the memories of the night before remained vivid and terrifying. Mark's hand shook as he reached for the steering wheel, his mind racing. He started the car and quickly pulled back onto the road. He needed to get away from this place as far as possible.